So tonight, my goal is very quickly is to have a conversation that I think we're all having within our circles, especially with what's happening in today's society. It kind of sucks out there, can I be real? And so I would love us to not shy away from big topics and to have, hopefully, a really fun and engaging conversation. So to kick off for everyone is simply what inspired you guys to write a book or books mainly about or featuring women?
Okay, I'll go. I had been thinking for a lot about single women as an historical archetype for a very long time, and frustrated that the conversation around what it was to be a single woman was so limited. And so this was, around the year 2000 when I was in my late 20s, or, turning 30, and the only examples were Carrie Bradshaw or Bridget Jones. And, I knew that the second wave of the women's movement had showed us other ways of being women, but those ideas weren't very prevalent in the moment that I was coming of age in. So when I had the opportunity to write a book, I wanted to show the long reach of history around this conversation that feels and seems so contemporary when really it's not. It's the result of centuries of change and agitation and work. But what we're seeing now is a power in numbers kind of story. Now we finally have tipped over the half scale, so it changes the force of the conversation. So, and I wanted to, I figured because of this demographic shift that we were going to have a lot of books and articles addressing it, and so I wanted to put my own personal stamp on how I was thinking about it and put that forward as to be one part of this larger conversation to be had.
In my case, I think it stems from my day job, which is as a journalist, and which I was doing before I ever wrote books. And in my late 20s, I began to develop a beat around feminism. And at that point, I've been thinking about this a lot recently because it looks like there are a lot of young people here. I'm 41. I'm going to be 41 on Friday. When I was growing up in the 80s, it was such deep backlash. And I don't know if anybody here is of my generation. Like, I feel like there are generations of older people who were raised within like the political and social foment of the 1960s and 70s. And then there are younger people who've come of age in an era where there's a feminist blogosphere, and then more recently where there's Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, where there's a sense of protest and politics. But when I was a young person and, thinking about my own politics, which were always feminist, I never imagined that there would be an outlet for feminism in writing or in any professional capacity for me, because it was like frozen territory in the 80s. You couldn't be earnest about feminism. We were told that story was over, it was done, we were post-feminist, and it was there was just a chill on anything having to do with feminism. And so it was a real revelation to me in my 20s when I began to have a little bit of freedom just as a reporter. I'd learned to be a reporter on other topics as like a gossip columnist and writing about movie industry financing in New York City. I mean, really kind of, by some measures for me, duller stuff. But I began to get a little bit of freedom and be able to write from a feminist perspective. And there was a hunger for it, I think, because there was a generation like mine that had also been starved for it for their young lives. And this was about the time that the feminist blogosphere was exploding. And so I got to develop a beat that was about women in politics and culture. And so women have been at the center of the stories that I've been telling ever since then. So it's been a great surprise, pleasure, and freedom in my professional life.
So I sort of had a very twisty ride to writing these books. I started out, believe it or not, as a reporter for Us Magazine, of all things, covering red carpet events and movie premieres and award shows, and which was fun and glamorous, but didn't sort of satisfy like a deep part of me. And it was really covering the March for Women's Lives in 1992 that I had a whole bunch of epiphanies. One, it was these celebrities. That was the first time I interviewed people like Jane Fonda and Gloria Steinem, and Jonathan Demme was there, and Cyndi Lauper, who were using their celebrity to help promote a cause. And of course, then it was also this feminist epiphany of everybody was there, about women controlling the right to their own body. And so that really led me on this sort of new niche, which I've been really interviewing well-known people about the causes and organizations that they, promote for Huffington Post and for magazines. And then my first book, Daring to Be Ourselves, Influential Women Share Insights and Courage Happiness and Finding Your Own Voice was sort of a collection of different quotes that from all of the sort of amazing thought leaders that I had access to interview. And then this latest book, What Will It Take to Make a Woman President, also just happened incidentally, where it was just came out of my then 8-year-old daughter Lotus asking this question after Barack Obama was elected president. We were sitting around talking about how remarkable it was to have our first African-American president, and she turned to me and she asked, why have we never had a woman president? And it seemed like a really obvious, great question to ask, and I worked it into an article I was doing for CNN. I was covering the Women's Media Center Awards, and I decided to work it into my interviews about why have we not had a woman president. And so it was like Sheryl Sandberg and Arianna Huffington and Gloria Steinem and Jane Fonda, and I got quotes from Kirsten Gillibrand and Nancy Pelosi, and it wound up on the home page and got so much attention that my agent was like, this is your next book. And from there, it just sort of just exploded. It became, that so many people wanted to talk about this issue, this question about why we haven't had a woman president, what will it take to make a woman president, with sort of this lens into so many interconnecting issues that sort of are, shaping politics and our culture right now. And of course, everybody says, how did you time it so well, with Hillary's candidacy? And I didn't, it just sort of has naturally happened at this, exciting moment. So it's been a really fun project to be talking about right now.
Wonderful. So since it's Kate's release for her paperback, I definitely want to launch into the first issue, Single Ladies. So quick crowd question, how many of you are single? So this is the right audience. So real quick, women are no longer rushing down the aisle. Young women are working hard, making money, but critics, or since this is my crowd, the GOP, are afraid of this new image of a single lady. Why is she so scary? That's my question.
Well, do you want to start?
You did.
Well, first of all, the image of the single woman has always been threatening from the beginning of time, and that's one of the many reasons I used the word spinster as the title of my book, is that I like how it immediately broadcasts this lineage of complicated ideas that, originally the spinster was just a young woman who spun wool into thread to make a living. And it wasn't, because the only women who could leave the home to do that were women who didn't have children they had to take care of. Spinster then started to just sit in for, single women. But it wasn't pejorative until colonial America, when we were building a population and needed every woman to get with the program and be a wife and mother and breed, and to the tune of 8.2 children. So that's when spinster became negative, and then if you were still not married by 26, you were a thornback, and that has fallen out of use. And then
bring it back.
Yeah, I know, it's I love this species of flat, spiny fish is a thornback. So throughout time, the spinster changed, and also the age of the spinster has changed. So a spinster is, by definition, an unmarried woman. But when a woman is considered unmarried and a spinster was at 18 for a long time, marriage records stopped using the word about by the 80s. It's hard to track. And then spinsters themselves were living very radical and different lives. Like, who knows? Another reason I like the specter of the spinster is that she is mysterious and autonomous, that we think we know who she is. She's a lonely, unmarried lady who lives with too many cats, but in fact, we have no idea what she is doing behind her closed door of her home where she lives alone. And there's a lot of power to the history of who that woman was. I don't know if I answered anything. I just kind of, anyway, what do you have to say?
No, I would have said all that too. It was great. I think one of the interesting things for me, looking at the history of the early hetero married norm in the United States and beyond, is that in part it reflects economic and political realities, which is that for hundreds of years, women were dependent on men economically, also socially and sexually. If they wanted to have liberated sex lives, if they wanted to have a family, they had to do so within marriage. But the real key to that was this economic dependence. And and marriage was an organizing institution that organized power. And the reason that marriage happened at the beginning of women's lives, like the beginning of their adulthood, was because there weren't a lot of great options for women to live economically autonomous lives unless they were attached to men. And so you see, even with women who did live independent of marriage in earlier eras, they were often still dependent on fathers, on brothers-in-law, because even if they could find ways to earn wages, those wages were reduced. Their pay gaps extend really deep into our past. It was very hard for women to find any kind of economic stability outside of a relationship to a man. And so one of the reasons that the disestablishment of marriage as the organizing principle of women's adult lives is so threatening is because it is symptomatic in many ways of women being competitive earners, of being able to live independently, I mean, really no longer dependent on men and on marriage for their adult validation, stability. There's increase, and of course, a lot of these are won from disruptive political and social gains made by women, especially in the late 20th century. The ability for them to get more education, to enter different fields, to earn higher wages, to have contracepted sex legally. There were Supreme Court decisions. There's development of the birth control pill. There's the legalization of abortion. But those political victories, which were themselves, as we know, so disruptive and threatening to so many people, now have created simply a new reality where masses of women can live independent of marriage as a mass behavior. It doesn't need to be ideologically motivated. It doesn't have to be self-consciously political. It's not, we have millions of women living more of their lives outside of marriage, not because they're saying, I reject marriage as a patriarchal institution. So, a few are, but the mass number, they can be evangelical, Republican, conservative women in Kentucky, as you know, one of the women I interview in my book is, and it's just the reality on the ground is different for women, and that in itself is tremendously threatening because it is a readjustment of our expectations about who has what kinds of power and who doesn't. So that's why I think they're threatening.
Yeah. I'm not sure if you have anything. And then I guess for me, when you talk about, being autonomous and the sort of like being sovereign, like why would you think, is marriage the tipping point for this? Because, you have single, unmarried, it's complicated, but it seems to be that women sort of lose their steam or prerogative when they get married. And to kind of follow up, like, can you be married and still stay sort of sovereign and true to self?
What do you mean by the first part of the question?
I felt like for you too, the sort of tipping point where we see an increase of like women just sort of stepping back tends to be when they get married. Even if they're in a relationships or they have partners or they have these sort of communities, it tends to be with the ring that things just sort of fall apart. And I'm kind of curious about why the ring is this climax and then it kind of disappears.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that marriage itself is undergoing so much change also, and it's always been changing and it always will change. But what we're seeing now is that marriage has been made egalitarian. So our parents' my parents' generation was of that generation that was redefining marriage post women's liberation and having equality in the home. And so now we live at a time when marriage is not oppressive the way that it was for so many years. When, in the 1830s, the women like Louisa May Alcott were rejecting marriage, because she was saying, I have novels to write. I don't want to be some dude's maid and, clean his fireplace or whatever. I have stuff to do. And, that's not what marriage is now. But marriage is still so central to the way we organize society and culture itself that there's still the cult of the couple is still very strong, and there's a kind of lag there, right? So there's been this huge demographic shift that everybody's been doing unknowingly, just living their lives, taking advantage of the opportunities that have been won for them, getting educations, getting jobs, et cetera, and pushing marriage off, yet marriage itself still remains this society's highest ideal, and then the construction of it is, the nuclear family or the kind of inwardness sex, but some of that is necessary. I mean, as you know, that getting married and having children takes a lot of time. So there is a different way in which that energy can be used. I think of Gloria Steinem being such an interesting example of this as someone who's been a lifelong single except for her very brief marriage and has been living on the road, as she talked about in her most recent book, and living in this very expansive way for all of her life where she wasn't centered on a nuclear family. And she's a very great model for what single women's lives can look like, and she's been living that her whole life.
I agree with Kate completely that we are in the process of making marriage mean something different. I mean, the fight for same-sex marriage redefines what the institution does. And as Kate points out, and there are great books about this, like Stephanie Kuntz and Nancy Cott's books about the history of marriage and the way that it has always changed. It's always meant different things in different, technological, agricultural, economic circumstances for different cultures. But we are in the midst of a massive shift here and around the world as we struggle to make marriage, which, as I said, was this organizing institution around power and gendered power, mean something totally different, so that if you have people of the same gender marrying, it can no longer serve this function of being something that dictates one of the people in this unit has more power than the other, or a different kind of power, or a different set of responsibilities. I also argue that people staying single longer changes the egalitarian structure, that we're still very much in the midst of this, in part by remaining independent entities for more of our adulthood, so that if men and women, and this is a hetero context, if men and women are living independent of marriage, if they are living for years, for decades of their adulthood as professional peers, as friends, as people who might have beers together or have sex but not necessarily be bound for 50-year legal relationships, that if and when they do enter a traditional hetero marriage or partnership later, there's a greater likelihood that they're going to enter it on egalitarian terms. And the same is true of their learning to live independently. So you're not just moving from your family's house into another house where the domestic responsibilities are going to be divided the same way, and women are going to be responsible for these things, men are going to be responsible for these things. Increasingly, as men and women live independently, and more of them earn paychecks and more of them learn to cook breakfast, then you have partnerships, if they form them down the road, in which it's not, those responsibilities aren't going to be distributed by dint of gender alone, that it can be, well, both people here know how to, use an electric drill, and both people know how to do the laundry, and both people are earners. I would argue that that the process is slower, I don't think marriage is yet where it needs to go as far as egalitarian distribution. There are lots of time use studies that still show women doing enormously more of the domestic work, and certainly after childbearing, this is extra true. And there was a study done a couple of years ago that showed that delaying marriage for women with college educations, delaying marriage past 30 resulted in an economic difference in earnings of $18,000. For women without college educations, it also, delaying marriage past 30 also showed a gain, but only $4,000. For men, the inverse is true. Marrying early makes men earn more money. And there's some studies about academics and on the tenure track and who gets tenure quickest. And if you take men and women, getting their full professorship, they tend to do it in X number of years. But if you then have them married, it takes women longer and it takes men less time. So you still have lots of contemporary evidence that even as we move toward a more egalitarian arrangements, we still have remnants of these old differentials where women are picking up more of the unpaid labor of taking care of lives, while men are freed up more to devote themselves to their careers in ways that produce unequal power distributions. So I don't think we're there yet. I think we're in the process of it, and shifting away from that early hetero marriage imperative is a big part of it, I think.
And kind of touching on that, because I was listening to a podcast this morning, and they were sort of touching on, especially with Donald Trump's usage of the women's card and whatnot, that as women gain in power, and more that they've seen this sort of call for a rise of victimhood among men, men's rights activists, Gamergate. I mean, you can go on with all these sort of like crazy things that are happening. What would you say we should do to sort of address this backlash? Because it's routinely happened, and what can women sort of do to take back the conversation?
Well, I mean, I think that anytime you see sort of women gaining in power, whether it's here in the United States or, around the world, you do tend to see that type of backlash. And I think it's because, there's a threat, there's a perceived threat, especially to like these conservative forces that are out there, whether it's in Congress or in Donald Trump. To me, I feel like in some ways, it serves a purpose, because I feel like we've been a little bit complacent and apathetic to this low-level kind of sexism, misogyny that's in our culture. But when it's as blatant as it is with like Donald Trump, or literally the threats to reproductive rights, we really can't sit back on the sidelines anymore. So I feel like it is awakening women and others who care about issues of equality and for women's causes to really pay attention and use our voices and be a part of the conversation, but also in speaking out against it. So to me, I feel like in some ways that it's healthy to have it be pushed, that we almost needed it to, because one of the things I learned about in doing the book is just this kind of like we think we're more equal than we are. It's really, we're 50% of the population, and when you look at the numbers of whether it's women in Congress, less than 20%, or on corporate boards, or we've never had a woman president, or the pay gap, all of these things, it's astounding. And I remember a lot of people just reminding me that it wasn't so long ago, like women didn't even have the right to vote. Like that seems almost like science fiction. But the truth is, it's not only like startling and wrong that we're 50% of the population and we're not represented in what's supposed to be, a representative, democracy. So that's why this isn't like a women's issue. This is like a human issue. And so to me, my hope is, because I do think we've been sort of sitting on the sidelines, that is as blatant. I mean, that the only positive that could come out as someone who is as bombastic and horrendous, I hope there's nobody that likes Donald Trump in this audience, as a Donald Trump, is that it really, it makes everybody pay attention and realize that they better get involved and use their voice and their vote.
And can I ask a question now? Do you have any thoughts about getting men more involved in feminism, or turning feminist issues into humanist issues?
Yes. I mean, one of my... I have a whole initiative at feminist.com that's called Men and Women as Allies. It's in partnership with Michael Kimmel and the Center for the Study of Men and Masculinities. We've done 2 events. We're doing a 3rd one after the election to come up with a gender allies agenda. We just did one because we were just talking about, it was about at work and at home. And what's so interesting about those conversations is that the men that we had, even at the work and at home panel, say, include us. Like, we want to be allies, but women, we need to figure out ways to allow them in. And the men that were saying that they wanted to share in parenting, they wanted to share with these things at home, oftentimes, there's a stigma against men doing this. Mm-hmm. And so I think we have to redefine feminism as not just about freeing women from these constrictive gender stereotypes, but also men and boys too. Mm-hmm. So, but I think part of it is finding ways to include men and sort of opening up the conversation to them. I think it's absolutely essential. I don't think we're going to move forward until we do. So.
I agree.
And we sort of touched on this, and I feel like we should just bite the bullet. Is it by chance, or is this a reflection in society that we're facing an election that on one side we have the chance for the first woman nominee of a major party, and on the other side we have someone that is outrageously sexist and orange?
It is not.
It took me a second.
It is not by chance. And it is not by chance either that it's not just about Hillary. It is not by chance that we have our first African-American president sitting in the White House, and we have the giant orange phallus that is Donald Trump also spouting xenophobia and open racism. This is it's not just Hillary, it's Obama and Hillary together, and there's larger symbolic value, which is obviously limited, and they're both flawed, and they're both, with any kind of, all the firsts are so rife with limitations and and ways in which they are not representative, and we can cover that for hours and hours, and the ways in which they disappoint us and frustrate us. But it is true that in the whole of American history, we have had white men, and suddenly we have had 8 years of a not white man, and that the front runner right now is a woman. And this is a symbolic moment in which the social and political revolutions that have been happening for the past, since before the official birth of the nation, are coming into a kind of symbolic relief around the presidency, which is an office that holds so much symbolic weight as far as the picture of who America is and who represents us. And it is not at all accidental. I can't believe it's happening. I did think it would be against like Jeb, who would be more subtle about these things. Their policies have always been this, right? This is just making the subtext text, right? This is what voting restrictions, Citizens United, reproductive rights restrictions, this is what the Republican platform has been about, is sexism and racism. It's just that we're now converting it into campaign rhetoric instead of claiming it as subtle policy differences and officially giving lip service to respect for women and, celebration of increased diversity in politics. Now we're just saying we want to kick people out, and we're going to talk about women in ways that I can't, but it's incredible. It is incredible that it's happening. I'm shocked, and yet I'm totally not shocked. This is what it was always about. It's so real right now.
That is like the quote of the night. It's so real right now.
It is so real right now. Yeah.
And to kind of take it into like an issue with like women's reproductive rights, and I think it's without to say I think the closing of abortion clinics is sort of like an onslaught. But I've heard something a little bit more subtle, especially on Facebook with like EliteDaily.com. I feel like posts a lot of these about women being less monogamous and how that's an issue. And I see things where it's like the hookup culture is bad, the hookup culture is great. Is this a big NBD? Are women being empowered? Are they being taken advantage of? Is this helping with the rise of staying single for longer? I'm just sort of interested on your guys' thoughts on that entire...
On hookup culture.
On dating, hookup culture, being young.
Mary, I'm curious to know, well, just because you've been... Feminist.com just celebrated its 20th anniversary. So, yes, yeah.
I can't believe it. Yeah.
And really, hookup culture itself is, how old is it? Is it like 25 years old in a way? Like, I feel, I entered college in 91 or something, and it was hookup culture then.
But were people freaking out about it? Because I was in college then too, and nobody was, but everybody just hooked up, but nobody was freaking out about it.
Right, yeah, right. Yeah, exactly.
I'm always surprised when people freak out about it now, because I'm like, this is what we were doing, and I'm old.
Yeah. So,
the question.
I don't know. Just what have you seen about? What do you think about hookup culture? What have you seen from your bird's eye view?
Wow, I've never been asked that question before. I think that women coming into their own and into their own, sexuality and making choices for themselves that are not tied into things like marriage or worrying about what if they're going to be called a slut and all of these things. So to me, I just think this all just represents women being able to make their own choices and whatever that is. So I'm not really sure that I know, how it's evolved into where we are today with it. But for the most part, I know, even when, it's so interesting because when you think about somebody like, Beyonce or somebody who like claims themselves as like sexual beings, I feel like there still is that, on the one side, some people frame it as, oh wow, she's, she's sort of owns her sexuality, and then other people who say, oh no, she is just kind of, playing the male fantasy. So to me, I don't almost like care about any of that. To me, I'm more about, one of the things that I got from the interviews that I did in my book, and this may be totally off topic, but like, the people that I spoke to, the female leaders who range from someone like a Gloria Steinem to a Nancy Pelosi, the thing that they all had in common, or Anita Hill, the thing they had in common, they didn't care what people think. They just did their own thing, and if they wanted to hook up and that was who they are, and they did it because that was authentically them, and it was they weren't doing it for anything other than because that's what they wanted to do for themselves. It's only when it's done out of pressure or insecurity that I think it's an issue. So I know it's a sort of complicated answer, but I think hopefully it's just women, if that is who they are, then they should feel free to do that and not be labeled as anything. So I don't know if that answered your question, but that was my commentary on hookup culture.
Thank you.
Can I say one thing about hookup culture, which is that I think that we are always very eager to diagnose something as good or bad, like uniform, like, is this liberation or is it new forms of objectification? And I think one thing we often lose is that as we move forward and our technologies change and our social habits change, opposite things can be true simultaneously, right? So hookup culture, or if now you want to talk about it in terms of Tinder and apps and like different kinds of mating rituals enabled by different kinds of technology and I do think that the panic started when, at the end of the 90s, the millennium, when it became clear that the marriage pattern was changing so dramatically. So the marriage pattern really started to shift dramatically during the 90s. And that's when post-sexual revolution, college campuses were like, there are studies, my parents' generation was having more sex than kids today. Like, seriously, they've done this, different kinds of sex. Now there's a lot more oral sex, and this is Peggy Orenstein wrote a great book about this recently. But the panic about hookup culture and what it meant for young women really began to ramp up, perhaps coincidentally, about the time that the marriage pattern specifically for white middle-class women began to shift dramatically. And I don't think that's coincidental. It is also true that new forms of sexual liberation offer all kinds of positives, more diverse options for how you might live your life sexually. If you are a woman, those are good things. It is also true that hookup culture and app dating culture is still rife with sexism and an unequal power distribution. But the way in which people, in their panicking, which happens every time there's a new form of female sexuality that is made popular or public, people freak out and they concern troll it so that it's about like, women are being objectified in terrible ways, they're being mistreated. And it is true. It is also true that those levels of power imbalance have been true in every other iteration of dating and mating and partnering through the past. And so I think it can be simultaneously true that women in today's sexual marketplace experience all kinds of injustice. It is also true that that was the case when they were married off to the guy they rubbed against at the community dance when they were 17, and marital rape was legal and they couldn't get their own mortgages, which was true. Both of those things were true until the 1970s. So I think some of the panic about how this is a new scourge of sexism is like we forget that men having had more social and sexual and economic power has been true in every iteration of dating and sexual congress.
Great, yeah.
In terms of choice, I think the fight with like reproduction rights right now, like whether or not insurances should cover birth control, like and access to it. I've seen an article recently about like why don't we serve birth control, like why aren't birth control accessible at like Duane Reade, because you could buy Sudafed and things like that. Where do you think using a woman's choice of like sexual reproduction kind of ties into power and control? And I think with like remaining single and being the ability to be like liberated and all that kind of ties in.
Well, absolutely, reproduction has been a way to oppress women and repress them. And so that's part of the fear around women being able to have their own choices and do what they want with their bodies. That culture, or patriarchy doesn't want women to have that kind of power.
And I guess for me, like when you see that Roe versus Wade was passed so many years ago, and now all of a sudden there's like a resurgence, where do you think that's correlating? That like why now it's coming all the way back when we kind of felt like you settled it, and now it's coming back and even fiercer than before?
I think partly it's really easy to keep. Because Planned Parenthood and abortion is so visible, it's a very easy lightning rod for people to keep fighting about, even though the fight itself has already been fought and won. But I don't know. What do you think about the current moment?
I think controlling women's reproduction is at the heart of controlling them economically. I think if women cannot exert control over their reproductive lives, if they cannot exert control over their bodies, then that is where they lose their economic freedom. If you do not have the freedom to contracept affordably, reliably, if you do not have the freedom to get abortions affordably, excessively, sure, that too. If you do not have access, to safe and affordable reproductive health care at every stage of pregnancy, and then beyond that, if you do not have paid leave, if you do not have subsidized daycare, there are all kinds of things, because reproduction takes place in women's bodies, leaving them unable to exert control or exert any kind of economic control over their lives leaves them incredibly vulnerable. The fight to recontain women's sexual autonomy and reproductive autonomy is key to taking away the power that is increasing and makes them so threatening. So if you do not, the things that are on the table in this election, for example, if you do not mandate paid leave, if you do not mandate equal pay, if you do not mandate, not that these things are all going to happen in the next, but these are the questions we're talking about. If you do not work to subsidize early education and find a way to treat women as the earners that they are in ever increasing numbers, if you take away women's right to have an abortion, if you take away her access to both sex education and birth control, you render her dependent on men again. You can take away, people ask me when I've been talking about unmarried women, like, are we going to see a turn back in the pattern because we've been moving away from marriage, yeah. You can, that's what a lot of these politics are about. You can make laws and pass legislation that makes women dependent on men again. And you can return us to a status in which we have to be economically dependent on men again. You can do that by doing all those kinds of things. And the heart of it is removing women's reproductive control, which is absolutely key to their economic autonomy and equality in the world.
And I just wanted to add to everything that they said that I think it's also about the rise of religious extremism in our government. That's where a lot of it's coming from. And also, this is why we need more women in government. These are men who are legislating over women's bodies. And, so this is why we need women there to, it's the same thing when you're talking about, sexual assault in the military and that famous optic of all those white, male generals who were the ones making decisions on it. This is why we need women there to be advocating. These are issues that directly affect women's lives, and men should not be the ones legislating on them.
And I feel like with the sort of where a lot of these battleground states are happening, so I'm from Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, these sort of southern states, and I know you sort of touch about it in one of your interviews about geography being so important. Why is it harder to be a spinster in the South than in the East, and why do you think it's sort of divided by geographics like that?
Well, the culture, the Southern culture is just so much more marriage-centric and sexist, and has been. But I don't know why that is. Is there an answer for that? Does it have to do with slavery? probably. And the East has more, or the Northeast has a longer tradition of education and letting women be educated. So you could be a blue stocking, or you could be a pair of women living together in a Boston marriage. There were ways of living singly that were acceptable-ish. Whereas in the South, it's a lot different. And I've gotten a lot of blowback from women in the South saying, this is all, I don't believe this, marriage is important. So it's like guns, it's holding on to what is considered a tradition.
I think the differentiation, even more than North or South or East or West, is urban versus rural and suburban.
Yeah.
And so, for example, Atlanta, which is deep South, it has one of the highest populations of unmarried women in the country. And the Northeast is a higher concentration of cities, which makes it, and there is an explanation for the urban versus rural and suburban, which is that cities have forever, and one of the things that was so fascinating to me when I was researching my book and learning the history of single women around the world is that, like, in early modern France, in the countryside, a lace factory would open and all the single women would go to the lace factory because it was a chance to earn wages. Cities have jobs. Cities have infrastructures that make life as an unmarried woman more possible, and have historically. They have, there's a greater density, there are more living spaces, there's public transportation, the homes are smaller, and there's a community of other single people, of potential romantic and sexual partners, but most importantly, there are jobs. And so cities and unmarried women and later married women have always gone together in all kinds of cultures. And so I think that is the differentiating factor more than anything else. And it just happens to be that lots of the South has more rural areas. The Northeast is this concentrated group of cities. So we get these larger associations, but I think it's rural versus urban.
And that, I'm really curious to see what happens with our architectural landscape and how that changes in response to this demographic shift. And so we're seeing that now with Bloomberg's micro apartments, but how else would that be? And the city really did develop as if to support the life of the single person. And so how are we going to be bringing that kind of living into more rural areas or small towns where there are also single populations? It's not just an urban phenomenon. And one reason this, I think, caught everybody by surprise is that the numbers of singles were growing, but still always the minority wherever it was happening across the country. And then it was like one day, boom, it was a national number, but it was still invisible wherever you actually were.
So quick change of pace. How many of you guys watched Lemonade? Okay, I was like, if your hands are not up, I'm judging you. Just joking. And I would love to sort of talk about this because I think everyone's talking about it. And there's been a lot of criticism with Beyonce for staying with Jay-Z. And even like claims that she's playing into a stereotype in some sense. Do you think this is fair? And what are your thoughts about how feminists should react to someone who stays with a cheating partner? Big questions.
You guys have anything?
Okay. Let's see. Well, I think to me, the biggest thing when I think of what feminism is not about judging each other's choices. And so I think that for me, well, first of all, I feel like, this personal connection now to Beyonce, because out of nowhere, she recommended my book in this interview. She literally, I didn't believe it when I first found out. She recommended all her younger fans read What Will It Take to Make Women President. It will inspire you to be a better leader. And to me, it was less about my book and more about that message that she just, because she doesn't really endorse a lot of things. So I really paid attention to why she did that. And I think, that's what I feel about Beyonce. I feel like she's always been in tune to her inner leader. She doesn't care, even from my opinion, in her career or in her art, I feel like she mostly beats to her own tune. She's very authentic in who she is. And in seeing Lemonade, which I did watch, and I was like in awe of like the whole thing. I felt like it was so brave. I mean, she was so in her strength and her vulnerability and her emotions and everything else, and it was beautiful. Like by the time we were through that journey, because I went through the thing, I was mad, and by the way, nobody has officially said that it is true, that let's just put that on record, that it was Jay-Z that cheated on her. I mean, that's the implication. But regardless, she got to this beautiful, like, you know, redemption, healing part at the end that seemed very spiritual. And like, who am I to question the decision she made in her life? And I thought it was very brave. And aside from the fact that I've been really reading so many of these think pieces, is that what they're called? Think pieces? About how much it's resonating with Black women and their experiences. And so it feels like it was so important for that. And for me, even as like a white woman reading that, you know, to me, feminism is now about this intersectionality that of having all of these multiple identities. And so to me, I think it is just a very feminist statement, Lemonade, for many reasons. And I do think that ultimately, you know, the thing that we must do, I think, as feminists is respect, you know, whether it's a woman's choice to wear makeup, stay at home, you know, with her kid, whatever it is. I just feel like we should stop judging, you know, other people's choices. So that's sort of is my take on it, although I'm very open to others.
I am not having to do with Beyonce specifically. I think I am more open to judging other people's behaviors on feminist terms. Like I get anxious about what is now often called choice feminism, and this idea that like that the women's movement in the many forms that it's taken over the years, that its ultimate goal is just to create this space where any choice made by a woman is feminist and safe from critique. So I think I probably would take a different I'm all for judging people. However, I'm not so much for judging individual choices, right? You feel free amongst your friends. But like, I think that one of the things that feminism or any movement that's about expanding opportunity and revising systems in which there is disproportionate power is about critiquing those systems. And so those systems can be like the practice of people taking their husbands' names when they get married. But that doesn't mean that you have to write a public excoriation of a celebrity woman who takes her husband's name when she gets married. It can be about pointing out that the system and the power inequities that represents are still very much in play, and that, you know, and that said, to me, I don't have any judgment for Beyonce staying with Jay-Z. Like, basically, my interest when it comes to feminist approaches to partnership, marriage, sex, and is to create the systems where it is possible for women to live outside of marriage and to leave their husbands if they want to leave their husbands, and to have the chance of economic security, which obviously Beyonce does, outside of their marriage. It's not about, I mean, and this was something you saw a lot around Hillary Clinton, and you still do an enormous amount of judgment about her decisions not to leave Bill Clinton. These are valid conversations. They're not ones that resonate for me. I think the thing that you say about that is, I think, especially important about Beyonce is that, you know, feminism has long, and the women's movement has long been a diverse movement. It was founded by women of color, but the public representation of the women's movement has always been very white. And one of the things that is so fascinating about Beyonce and so exciting about Beyonce is that she is emerging as and there are a million quibbles made by millions of different people, but she is emerging as a face of feminism who is not white. And the stories she's telling are aimed at Black women. They are immensely powerful and popular, and they are the stories of Black women. Like, I am not interested in what I think about, like, as the white lead. Do you know what I mean? Like, I'm not saying it's not my job and I wouldn't want to say, but like, it's not for me. really, and that, but I want to enjoy it and think about it, but this is making visible something that's always been in feminism. And the history, I write in my book a lot about the history of black women and marriage and singlehood, and it is some of the most important history when you talk about unmarried women in contemporary life, and they are often represented by the Carrie Bradshaws of the world. But the contemporary iteration of unmarried womanhood started in the post-war period, when it was black women whose families were cut off from the resources in the building of the white middle class in the United States that was government subsidized. The suburbs that were built for white people, the highways that connected those suburbs to the workplaces that cut off black families and left them in redlined communities, the way that white families got to take advantage of the GI Bill and the way that returning black servicemen didn't get to. Black families were cut off from the resources that made that kind of mid-century patriarchal nuclear family possible, and black women stopped marrying earlier and started delaying marriage starting in the 1950s, at the same time that white women were being sort of hustled back into these traditional nuclear homes. And this is how you get, in 1963, Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, and in 1965, the Moynihan Report, which takes unmarried black women and diagnoses them as central to systemic black poverty. But in fact, those women were pioneers of a behavior which was living outside of marriage and marital expectations that later became adopted by more privileged women and whiter women, until you get Carrie Bradshaw, and suddenly that thing that is diagnosable as pathology by Daniel Patrick Moynihan is Carrie Bradshaw and is representative of liberation when it's Sarah Jessica Parker. And so the story of appropriation of behavior and the history of black women and marriage is so key. And so Beyonce is playing a huge, her working out, fictional or non-fictional, of the power dynamics, and she's spoken, I cite her a lot in my book, she's spoken about the role of money and economic independence and marriage, and she's talking about these issues that are absolutely key to the history of black women, around marriage, around power, around family, and I just find it fascinating to watch.
And she's also global, so the fact that she can bring that message everywhere, every interview from anywhere around the world, everyone's asking me about Beyonce all the time. And for the record, I think she's a genius. I love her, so that's what I think about her.
And I do think it's interesting, especially when you start, there's been a lot of backlash against white feminism, and I'm sort of in the critique of I'd rather, very Roxane Gay, I'd rather be a bad feminist, not a feminist at all. But I do want to sort of talk about being single, being unmarried, being a spinster. Is there a level of privilege that comes with that women of color don't see?
Well, yeah, that's another facet of the word spinster, is that historically a spinster was by and large a white woman. Black women were having different experiences. They weren't being called spinsters. It was a privileged thing. And wait, what was the question?
No, I forgot. No, is there I was just sort of saying, is there a level of privilege, and especially for the modern day spinster, are we still seeing there's a level of privileges? I know there be parallels, but I'm sort of wondering how can we address the needs of women of color?
Yeah. So yes, it's a story of privilege, and one of the things I wrestled with writing my book was, I was writing about 5 women who lived at the turn of the last century who had influenced my own thinking about marriage versus not marriage in my real-time life along the way, and they were all white. And yuck, what am I going to do when I sit down to write this book? This is such a white book. Here I am, grew up in this lily white little town in the Northeast. I was influenced by these white women. How am I going to broaden out this book and make this a book about all single women, not just the kind of single woman that I am? And I decided I couldn't. That was a different book, that I wasn't going to fake it and bring in someone of color just to hit that note. And that this was my real story that I was telling it. And part of a point that is very important to me when we're thinking about single women is that the way we think about our own lives is so dependent on the context in which we are born into. So it's our historical context, our family context, our political context. You can't separate out the individual, and you can't separate out the single female experience there's no way of generalizing it. And so that I thought the way I could make my points most deeply and most authentically was to write strictly from my own sadly limited experience, and hope that by putting forth that story, it would be, as I said at the beginning of tonight, it would open up this conversation, and that other people would then tell their stories, but that I couldn't pretend to tell the whole large story. So, but yes, as far as privilege goes, it costs money to live alone, and so that's why the history of employment in women is inseparable from the history of single women. You need to be able to do it, and what to do about women who aren't privileged and don't have it as easy. That is a hugely complicated thing. I don't know how to address it myself.
I write quite a bit in the book about issues of economic privilege. There are a couple separate things. There's the issue of different circumstances as single women and different messages that you're sent. Black women are sent a whole very specific range of extra punishing messages about being black and single, because there's a storyline in the media that black women are still pathologically single in a way that white women might be perceived as being liberated, and sort of we're panicking about them with hookup culture, but which is really who people panic about when it comes to hookup culture. It's largely white privileged women on expensive college campuses who are hooking up. Okay, so that's where that panic comes. Black women face a whole separate set of messages offered by and codified by people like Oprah Winfrey. I mean, Steve Harvey has done television specials about what's wrong with black women, that they're not getting married and act like a woman and think like a man, or whatever, the reverse. And Tyrese has said, that you're going to independent your way to loneliness. There's just a barrage, and some of the women in my book, African American women, say the biggest stress for me is opening up magazines and reading about how there's something wrong with me because I'm not married. I'm too loud, I'm too aggressive, I'm too educated, and there's a whole register of criticism and punishment directed specifically at black single women. There's the other issue, which disproportionately affects women of color, but is not exclusive to women of color, is the economic divide. And so this is one of the reasons that social and economic policy is so crucial to the fact that women across classes are increasingly living outside of marriage, and they're not living in these roles that we've basically organized our economic and social policy around, where there's one kind of American who's an earner and who's in the public sphere, and there's one kind of American who is dependent on that earner and does the domestic work and the child care for free. That's not how we're living across classes. And what that means is that we now have to have social policy and tax policy and social policy, and even things like how school works for kids, like that it gets out at 3 and has long summer vacations. We have organized the infrastructure of our country around this idea of hetero married coupledom. People are not living that way. We need to reorganize our social and economic policies. So this means, for instance, again, things we're talking about in a political context, raising the minimum wage. Half of minimum wage workers are unmarried women, and many of them are women with children. 42% of unmarried women live below the poverty line. Unmarried mothers live below the poverty line. So we have to do things like raise the minimum wage, which would have a direct impact on unmarried women, unmarried mothers. We need to protect reproductive rights, because that disproportionately impacts low-income women and women of color. The Hyde Amendment, which means that women can't use state insurance programs to pay for their legal reproductive health care. Creating things like paid leave, mandating subsidized childcare. All these things would help to account for the shift in marriage patterns, where we no longer have wives at home. Paid sick day legislation, which is happening in cities and states around the country. So it's not so much, the difference in my mind, lots of people and it's conservative dogma to say we need to reinstitute marriage because these women living independently on one income and having kids outside of marriage, they're living below the poverty line, and so the fix for that is marriage. To me, that makes no sense. Marriage to whom, right? So what we can do is fix our social policy to create a bigger safety net, increased welfare benefits, higher wages, more social programs that account for the fact that men and women are both earning and taking care of families, and that we need a government that supports that population the way they're living now, not the way they lived 50 years ago.
Yeah, I've definitely found that the messages of Spinster have been received more openly by Canada especially, and I think that has everything to do with the governmental support that they have, that we still live in a country where we all like to say we marry for love, and we do, but we're also marrying because we get health care and we can combine our incomes and live in this world. But we don't want to admit that to ourselves. But Canada, because they have more of a support network, all of these numbers are happening there and have been happening longer there, and so they're more used to this conversation. It's been very interesting.
And in the last chapter of your book, you titled it "Are Women People Yet?" And it depresses me to ask, but I'm sort of curious what you guys, for each of you, what would it take for that change to happen, for women to finally become elevated?
I'd say, well, I was asking that question rhetorically as the way to say, are we? Like, and kind of what you were talking about earlier, that we think we're so equal, and we're not. And so much of this invisibility, and so much about it being infrastructure and how our society is still, it's not working yet to accommodate us. So it's hard to see the ways in which women are being held back until people, Rebecca did a great job of diagnosing and bringing forth suggestions about how to change things. For me, I'd say it's absolutely about raising minimum wage, making sure that women can be working and continue to have those opportunities and control over their reproductive rights. And as long as we're able to be living as human beings who aren't being defined by our gender-coded restrictions, then we will be living as people first.
Yeah, I mean, I would just agree with that, the last part of it. I would say that Are Women People is when the idea that they might have full, complicated, diverse lives that include participation in a public sphere and a domestic sphere and a romantic sphere and or a sexual sphere, which is what we assume to be the normal state of male adulthood, is not called having it all, and it's some like piggy acquisitive project where we just want to have it all, like what dudes have, and where the range of opportunities presented to a person is neither more expansive nor more constrained, depending on what gender that person is. That would be when I would consider women as people.
I guess, coming fresh out of my book and thinking through, this question of encouraging, women's leadership, to me, well, first of all, it is kind of this reframing as this being a human issue. I feel like, if we just look at, the world has so many serious problems right now that we face, and we really do need women's voices and visions as part of the solution. So to me, it's not just beyond just about equality anymore, but the takeaways I got from my book, which I think is just connected to this question. One is also just starting with girls, because by the time, when you talk about all these choices that women are, faced with making, and being able to make the choices for themselves that are in line with their, true selves, true calling, it's encouraging girls to value their voices and encourage self-esteem, and looking at all these very disempowering media messages that are hurled at girls from literally the second that they're born, that seek to just disempower them so much so that they don't even realize it. That they just, just lose complete. I remember when I interviewed Jane Fonda, and she said this line to me that she didn't come into her true voice till after her divorce with Ted Turner at 60. I mean, 60? So how do we, preserve, how do we have women, girls be able to value, their voices and see themselves as contributors and give them everything that they need to be able to fulfill their calling and destiny? And then all of these other things that we're talking about are so central to it, whether it is about supporting working women in families and monitoring the portrayal of women in the media. And I also think the big part of it for me, is including men, because I think until we start to, I remember when Gloria Steinem said it's just as much about encouraging women to see themselves as experts and, authoritative figures as it is about having men and boys see themselves as caretakers and nurturers. It's that full circle. Let's all embrace all of our human qualities. There is no feminine and masculine anymore. So to me, all of those things are essential to that conversation.
Yeah, and I want to add something too about the perniciousness of media and consumer culture and what Stephanie Kuntz calls the haughty mystique. So she's saying, once upon a time it was the feminine mystique, and now the haughty, H-O-T-T-I-E. It's that the beauty standard is so out of control, and so young women, we can raise them up with these messages, but they are living in a world that is giving them all kinds of different, harder messages. And one reason it's important to be talking about this change, this shift in marriage and single people, that we are actually have been and will continue to be living longer unmarried, means we're spending a lot of time dating and on the romantic market. And I think that feeds into this. It's pretty cyclical, or just that the relationship between consumerism and media and the romantic market. And that part of that is because people are still thinking, so I like to think dating made a lot of sense when my mother was getting married, because she was single for a couple of years, dated, met my dad, got married. And now here we are, single and dating 10 years, 15 years, and dating is still, for a lot of people, a very dominant part of life. So I think just to be saying, hey, everybody, we're not actually getting married. That this is taking longer. We're spending a longer time on our own. Let's deprioritize that part of being single.
I do think it's interesting. It's like once you hit 2 years, people start expecting for people to pop the question.
Oh, right. Oh, in a relationship? Yeah.
I've just noticed that.
Well, no, that's a great point. And just the expectations we have. I've never felt any pressure from my family about what I was supposed to do in marriage, but I felt pressure from friends and just the concern of you've been seeing him for 2 years now, so what happens next? Are you moving in? And the expectation that everything has to go according to a plan. Yeah.
Interesting. So before I open up to Q&A, I do, this is a bookstore. I'd love to grab a book that you've recently read that you would recommend.
Well, I'm actually Thursday I'm interviewing Gloria Steinem, so I'm reading her book right now, her new one, and I'm really enjoying it. I didn't really expect to. I think it's really good. Yeah. I like her a lot, but I just wasn't prepared to like the book as much as I do.
I have to think for a second.
Yeah, I did.
No, wait, no. I read a bunch of books and I want to figure out which one. When I was on book tour, when I was finishing my book, I went through this period where I didn't have any books going, which is horrible for me because I am always reading. I actually mostly read fiction. And then I finally, was able to have books going, and now I'm just thinking, what did I really like? I really like the Hanya Yanagihara book, A Little Life, and I also liked Peggy Orenstein's nonfiction book, Girls and Sex, which I learned a lot from. And I loved Dawn McKean's memoir it's a 100-year walk, about her grandfather's escape from the Armenian genocide, which is an incredible book, and I really recommend that.
I'm really embarrassed to say that most of the books that I read right now are for the people that I'm going to be interviewing upcoming. So I've recently read Russell Simmons' Happy Vegan, because I just interviewed him. And I'm right now reading The Sleep Revolution by Arianna Huffington, because I am going to be interviewing her about that. And all I'll say, that allows me to interject the concept of self-care, because I had also interviewed her about Thrive. And I feel like that is something I can tell you, because I actually, that is an issue for me all the time. And I think if we're talking about this whole thing about women doing it all, having it all, this notion, that thing about the oxygen mask on first, and that women always tend to really at the expense of themselves, try to take care of everything and everyone. So to me, it's a good reminder as I'm reading Arianna Huffington's book, which is not just really about sleep, it is about just learning to relax and disconnect our minds and from our devices devices and just prioritize our, relaxation and taking care of our bodies, to me, seems to be a very relevant message that, we can all benefit from right now.
I have that on my desk. I should definitely read it. I don't sleep. So just want to open up to Q&A. Anybody have any questions? We'll start over here.
Hi, thank you all for coming tonight. So you mentioned a lot of the leading feminists from the 70s, Gloria Steinem, Jane Fonda. Who do you think are the leading feminists today that in 50, 100 years we're going to look back? Hopefully all three of you. Who else? What are their pop culture icons or leading academics? Like, who do you think is shaping the conversations today?
You know what I have to say is that, I feel like I'm so excited by the internet right now and just reading a lot of different voices. Like, I like the fact, because I know that's Gloria Steinem's big thing, is she hates being like a feminist icon and the whole concept of having an icon. And right now I don't really think there are that many. There certainly are some really prominent voices, but that doesn't mean that they deserve it any more than, just as an example, talking about Beyonce's Lemonade, I've been reading all kinds of commentaries by people whose names I didn't know. And some of these are well-known writers for big outlets. So to me, I think what I'm most excited about is learning from all of these, diversity of voices that are emerging online rather than just like one central person. I don't think in today's feminism you can have that anymore, but feel free to disagree.
Oh, I agree, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree too. I just think we're not built around, I think we're not built structurally the same way where there's like a political leader or one mouthpiece. Like, we look in so many different directions, and one of the good things is that we're democratizing who gets to participate in the conversations, and that is a good thing. So there are obviously a lot of, there are writers, Roxane Gay, Bad Feminist, is somebody who I think has, and in pop culture, look, like Emma Watson has a feminist book club. There actually are so many people who aren't political leaders, but who are participating in the conversation in ways that actor, the Matt McGorry guy I saw this weekend, was doing a ton of stuff. Like, there is, there are people participating, but one of the interesting things that I know you don't want to go back in time, but one of the interesting things about the democratizing the conversation and forcing us to look is that I think there's a re-examination of some past leaders and participants who did get in the media, which, remember, was very white and male for a very long time, and still is by many measures, that we're sort of returning to figures who didn't get enough attention, whether it's Shirley Chisholm or Flo Kennedy or Dorothy Haight or Fannie Lou Hamer or Ida B. Wells. Like, I think there's one of the things about democratizing the contemporary conversation is that we're digging up people historically who were never forgotten, but have not gotten the kinds of credit that they should when we still think of feminism as being led by Betty Friedan and Gloria Steinem. Yeah.
Right here.
So you guys kind of touched on this throughout about the need to have men involved in feminism and how feminism and humanism really does encompass men's rights as well, and talking about how it's changed with becoming intersectional and the rise in gender-neutral language and rights. So how do you guys see feminism changing in the future, and is there a need to broaden maybe the word itself?
Well, you two are more professional feminists than I am.
Professional feminist. When I first launched feminist.com, I did not set out to launch feminist.com. My husband had a background in solar energy and decided to found this site called ecomall.com way back when, and I was at a picnic and with a women's studies major named Teal, and the next thing I knew, I had feminist.com. And for a while, I was almost horrified to have this name. Like, what was I going to do with feminist.com? And that's how it started out, was because there's so much baggage attached to that word that for a while, I'd go to parties and Tom would be like, she's the president of feminist.com. I'd be like, shh, no one's going to want to talk to me. And so I remember back in the day, so my thing with feminist.com, and actually we are hopefully going to be totally reimagining, rebranding our site, because the only thing you can do when you have that name is to try to is to reimagine it, is to rebirth it, is to reclaim it and figure out ways that it can be really relevant and debunk all the stereotypes that, it's not intersectional or it doesn't include men or, just all of these things, that all the baggage that it has. So to me, I do think the future of it is going to find a way to be inclusive of just freeing everybody. You have to work. Someone once said to me, you can't be like a racist feminist. It's for everybody's right to be able to be free of prejudice and to live a life of fulfill their human potential. To me, that's my overarching view of what feminism is, without diluting the need to focus on women who are still so unbelievably oppressed and marginalized here. So,
and I definitely don't want to move away from feminism to humanism. This has always been one of my big complaints. Like when I interviewed Susan Sarandon many years ago, and I asked her about feminism, and this was like over 10 years ago, and she's like, I don't really think of myself as a feminist, I think of myself as a humanist. I was like, the word has always meant different things. Feminism always means different things. Feminism is like a permanently cacophonous movement that has always been a struggle of competing perspectives and ideas and priorities, as it should be, because it represents so many different kinds of people. A women's movement cannot be monolithic. It's impossible. It would be in very poor health if it were. And so I've always thought that its cacophony and its contradiction is a sign of its good health, and I'm very much for sticking with it. And I also should say, because I'm in complete agreement with everybody on this panel about bringing men into the conversation, I think it's crucial. I feel really strongly that it's necessary. I do feel like we have to show the ways that men benefit from feminism too. I completely agree, but I think I just want to add some mild ambivalence about it too, because there is a degree to which, as soon as men come into the conversation and are like, domestic violence is bad, and we're like, yay, and we give them a lot of extra credit for merely participating, when in fact it's like a baseline human thing to say. And I think that we want to be, we see in lots of movements and in lots of circumstances, there are still power differentials. And so I think, and this is not saying, I agree, we need to bring more men in, but I don't think it's uncomplicated.
Well, I was just going to quickly say, because that was one of the things I'd learned from the Michael Kimmel thing, is we need to figure out ways to have those conversations though together somehow. And it's been so interesting having this series, and we do have video, and we're going to launch it from the last one at the site, to have men and women together talking about this. But that example about violence, domestic violence, to me, when you hear about, when you talk about men raping women, it's also looking at why are men doing that? So I feel like it is interconnected. I feel like you do need to look to uproot some of these things that are happening to women. You have to sometimes look at why men are perpetuating these behaviors as being connected. But I do agree with what you're saying, and I think it has to be done with the utmost, care.
I also think that boys have to be introduced to feminism in women's studies young, and that it's still, even now, it's possible to be a thinking man who's correctly, in my mind, thinking about all things, but came to feminism very late, either because his girlfriend brought it to him, or because he was married and had a daughter and started thinking about feminist issues. So in the schools, we need to be thinking about that differently.
Over here.
So I think I'm probably...
By the way, that's my mom. I'm sorry.
Also, the oldest person in this room is a woman, and I just think I'm going to die if Hillary doesn't win. I'm thinking, when am I going to have another chance to have a woman as being president? So I think a good question to you would be, how is she going? How do you think she's going to win? I mean, what do you think she's facing? How should she handle this election, assuming Trump is going to be her opposition?
She's gonna crush him.
I don't know. I don't know. I feel like I'm entering the arena in the Hunger Games. I feel like I wake up in the middle of the night. I don't know what to tell you. I don't know. She might win. She might not.
Oh my God, she's not.
No, I don't know. I don't think any of us know. And I think if you listen to pundits on television who tell you well, as we can see this happen, and that doesn't matter. One of the things we learned in 2008 from Obama's election is that when you involve new people in the political process, both as candidates and then you draw in different kinds of voters, old models don't apply. So you can listen to 100 white guys on MSNBC right now, or CNN, or any of the other stations that feature mostly white guys, telling you about how this happened in 68 and this happened in 72 and this, we can look at the 2000 election. Yeah, that doesn't predict. They want to tell you, we know how this is going to play out. We know how they're going to strategize. I do not believe that anybody knows what's going to happen. We can make guesses. We talked earlier about how real this is. I actually think this is going to be seriously as nation forming as the Civil War. I mean, I think that this is not that the presidency itself matters, but that the attitudes about what direction this country is going, are we going to go forward to having different kinds of power sharing and different kinds of social and economic policies that support different kinds of participation in the Republic, or are we going to go backwards? I don't know. We're going to find out how we feel as a country about what direction we want to go. And I'm not sure I'm going to know, or that you're going to know, or that anybody in this room is going to be able to safely guess on like the night of November 8th. I don't know that we're going to know until it happens.
Please vote.
In other states, preferably. If any of you can vote anywhere else, vote in another state.
Going to Texas. We're going to be here in the back real quick. Oh, that's, yeah.
Hi. Thank you all for being here. On the topic of reproductive rights and this notion of control, you all talked about contraception, and I'm wondering about the other side of the spectrum, how with the kind of increasing influence of assisted reproductive technology and things like egg freezing, how that has the danger of giving women the illusion of control or an illusion of power that they perhaps might not have, or that would be dangerous to have. And I was just wondering about your thoughts on that.
Well, confession, Natalie is my student. So we've talked about this. And also, I mean, I wanted to bring up earlier, but I didn't want to be stealing your thinking, but she's working on a fantastic project about ignorance around fertility and how we need to, it's not happening in our schools, in our sex ed classes. And so we grew up, and I think of myself as being a perfect example of this, that I grew up not knowing how anything really worked. You know, I mean, like, not in a queasy way. I just didn't know I just didn't know that my fertility would end when it did. And I thought that I had more time, and I thought that I was growing up in a time where all these technological advances were happening. So by the time I was ready to start thinking about it, it would be just, a snap, and very ignorant. But so I want you guys to talk about, because I already, I talked to Natalie about this.
Yeah, I mean,
You can go.
Okay. So I think you raise a bunch of good questions. So on the one hand, and I think there are very mixed answers. Everything I say is like, well, both things are true at the same time, but it's true. So on the one hand, you have all these increases in reproductive technology that really do enable all kinds of flexibility that did not exist a few years ago. However, you have one starting set of problems, which is many of them are prohibitively expensive, and we do not support them through any health system, through any healthcare system, which is a larger problem in the United States. But for example, in Israel, reproductive technology, IVF, is paid for by the government, and that means it's actually a health question, because it means with this in the United States, where it costs like $20,000 or more a pop, and you can save and save and save and save, and then you put in 3 embryos, and you have older women carrying multiple pregnancies that are a danger to themselves and their health. I mean, there are all kinds of economic realities. The same with egg freezing. You see, as with paid leave, a lot of Silicon Valley companies providing coverage for things like egg freezing that, again, sort of broadens a class divide between who's able to exert this kind of power to the degree that the power exists and who's not. I also think you have a bunch of conflicting messages. On the one hand, there is this sort of like, freeze your eggs, it'll be cool. Like, what could go wrong? And there is that kind of, there is this message like, relax about it, you don't have anything to worry about, that can lead people to sort of forget. There was a piece by Vanessa Gregoriadis many years ago in New York Magazine when I was in my 20s about this, like, oops, I forgot about my fertility. But at the same time, there are also the messages to like 23-year-olds being like, your eggs are withering. Right now, they just withered more while we said this. And I felt those pretty acutely, right? I mean, so those things, those exist simultaneously, and different people, I think, pick up different messages depending on who they're. The radical thing, and I will be very unpopular for saying this, one of the radical things that I think is still a step beyond that we're not yet comfortable in doing as women's possibilities open up is a rethinking of family structure that unlashes traditional romantic sexual partnership from the question of reproduction. Not that I'm advocating a world in which couples, in which, it becomes, but I think one of the things that so many of the women I spoke to for my book struggled with was their competing desires to have a baby, in some cases being economically or even familially, like with having the familial support or the social support or a friend network where there were friends who were single, wanted to have kids and could do it together, but there's just still so much pressure that's like you're not to do it that way. You're still supposed to do it the old-fashioned way, which leaves them feeling very passive. Like, does the right person, somebody with whom I want to make this huge choice, show up within this window of time, and am I just passively waiting for that to happen? Or do we put in place both technologies and economic possibilities, like supporting women's choices through all kinds of social and economic programs, through housing, rearranging our housing laws so that to make room for communal parenting and between friends and in different family structures, more of a supported norm? Do we start, and it's a really radical, scary question, because there are a lot of people, I'm sure a lot of people in this room are listening to me and being like, no, two-parent families are better. I don't know that that's always the case. But I think it is a massive and terrifying and threatening idea to start to unwind some of those very old assumptions and see where they're correct and where they're not necessarily correct. And that is a radical step that women have to take as they begin to assimilate the realities of their bodies and their reproductive lives with an increasingly diverse set of opportunities that they have in front of them.
Okay. Right here.
This goes to the concept of family structure and how that can change. Obviously, looking at the history of marriage is coupled with the discussion of monogamy. So I'm wondering how you see monogamy and the cultural expectations of it fitting in with how and when women are choosing to marry and the larger conversation about it.
Ooh, that's good. Yeah, I mean, people ask me a lot about polyamory and how that seems to be on the rise. And I tend to think of monogamy versus not being one of those exceptionally personal decisions, that we should not have a cultural expectation for anything. And I happen to be a monogamous person, and I have flirted with hoping I could be otherwise, but I'm not. And insofar as how that fits into the bigger picture, I don't know. I mean, what I'm hopeful of, it's been really interesting to watch same-sex marriage and how, but even before that was happening, how the gay world has been influencing the straight world and making the straight world more progressive. So as the gay world was more visible, the straight world was questioning itself more. And so now that we have same-sex marriage, now that we have studies showing us that children raised by same-sex couples are okay, everything worked out fine, that it's about stability and love that a child needs, and with family structure changing, it will be very interesting to see how that all fits in. But I still think of polyamory as, even though maybe it is having a flourishing, as still being a niche way of or niche preference.
Another question? Right here.
Thank you all so much. I want to ask about how you talked about social policies and the need to revise them in order to allow women to make the choices that they want to make, which, coming from mainland Europe, yes, of course. And you also talked about the representation of women in political institutions. However, I feel that the issue of representation, for example, is mainly important in terms of exactly that, representativity, democracy, the idea that there's prejudice about women and roles that they can and cannot take. But I feel that very often the issue of women in political positions is also discursively, explicitly or implicitly linked to the idea that if women are in leading positions, that will lead to political decisions, which also favor other women. Also the whole debate with Hillary, for example. And there, I guess, I'm also more skeptical about this idea that, women's decisions are by definition feminist or pro-women. And I was wondering if you could maybe talk a bit to that and unpack that expectation or that assumption of it and see where it comes from and what its implications are of this assumption.
Carly Fiorina.
Sure. Well, I know it was really important to me when I set out to do the book to say that this isn't about, women being better than men or women being better leaders or, as Gloria Steinem said to me, this is not about biology, it's about the issues. And I think we've seen, and again, I'm just speaking to my own self, but like Sarah Palin wasn't what I had in mind. So, that being said, and I think the most important thing for me when I did the book, though, was to be bipartisan, because we need women on both sides of the aisle there, and to also make sure that when we talk about this issue, we don't make generalizations about women. That said, what I did hear from my interviews and from talking to some of the female senators, whether it was people whether it was Nancy Pelosi, Kirsten Gillibrand, people who were actually serving there, or others, was that women tend to be, I would do quotes, but I have this in my hand, better, oftentimes, consensus builders, good communicators, good listeners, to find common ground. This is something that even this Republican Senator, what's his name, Rob Portman, said in a New York Times interview, that even with the low numbers of women that were there, 20 in the Senate, already you could see that. And I think we can all agree that that is something that would be a really nice ingredient to have right now, is that consensus building, because right now it is so partisan. So, again, I think the point is less about saying that women are better. It's just we're 50% of the population. If we're pretending to have a democracy, it has to reflect the electorate. And we do bring, whether or not, we bring our experiences as women. It's like what we were talking about, choice, or talking about violence against women. These are things like only we can speak to some of these experiences. So that's where I would say, but no, it's never just been about just like any woman and, that women are better. So that would be my answer.
I don't think we have any evidence, and I've seen millions of pieces and lots of studies about this. I don't think that we have evidence in either direction, that when women are in charge, they either do more for other women or they don't. I just don't think, I almost never make an argument on those grounds, because I just don't think, we're still living in a world in which women leaders, whether we're talking about, and this came up a lot around Sheryl Sandberg's book, like if you have women at the top of corporations, are those corporations better for women? We don't know, because there's still so few organizations run by women. The women who run them are exceptions who came up as anomalies through patriarchal structures. The way that those patriarchal structures influence them, either they become these, feminist leaders who do paid sick time, or they become Carly Fiorina, who is terrible for women and for workers in general. I don't have to be nonpartisan. And but there's not equality, so we actually can't make, and a lot of the qualities that we attribute to women in leadership, for example, the consensus building, and you often hear jokingly like, oh, if we had more women, there'd be fewer sex scandals. I don't, sure, for a while, but if we actually could imagine a world in which women had equal opportunity and were equally represented, and in which we associated power with sexuality and sexual power for women, which is the inverse of what we've done forever, where having a lot of political power has never been the aphrodisiac that Henry Kissinger decided that it was, and the way that, we just don't have the same associations, that we're so culturally formed, so socially formed by the messages that we're sent, and that I don't think we can answer that question. What we have to, I think what we are working toward is having better representation, of being better representation, of being better represented, getting closer to to government, and then also in the worlds of business and in every realm, having our population actually represented and reflected in our government. And part of what that means, by the way, going to the Carly Fiorinas, the Sarah Palins of the world, is that the idea of better representation for women does not entail just having women that you can vote enthusiastically for. It is also women that you vote enthusiastically against. And that's something we have to get used to. And that's part of the process. I welcome the Sarah Palins because I will be thrilled to vote against her for the rest of my life. I don't think I'm going to have to. But that's part of it. They can't all be good girl heroines, feminist leaders. And when we hold them to those higher bars, and this is something you see around Hillary Clinton a lot, when we expect more of them, it actually bars a lot of them. They are the idea is that we would want them to be participating politicians like men are, and be just as good and bad and pure and flawed and corrupt and legit, and in all the same ways that our male representatives have been.
Great. So I'm going to go ahead and end it now. No, only because it's getting late and you guys will have to get a good night's sleep. Real quick, round of applause for Kate, Rebecca, and Marianne.